start the recording. Okay. So with us today, we've got Christina Ambers and Darlene Reams, and they're going to discuss Mythbusters, the Kanban edition. Do you two want to introduce yourself a little bit before you start your presentation?
We've actually got it in our presentation too.
Cool.
So I'm Christina Ambers, and I have quite a few certifications, but I've spent about 15 years working with development teams, probably a little bit more now, but I'm going to stop at counting at 15. I think that's a good round number to stop with. I used to lead our Dallas dojo practice before we had COVID. I actually ran it for teams remotely. So I was one of the first coaches ever to tackle the remoteness. And then I also give a shout out always to Mike Cohn. He trained me as a Scrum Master, and I'm very, very active on the Agile Mentors community. So if you're ever in with the AMC, you will see me over there a lot. My poor family, we practice Kanban and Scrum at home. So they're very well versed, probably more than they should be, on how to do all of these development and software methodologies.
And I'm Darlene Reams, and I have a whole collection of colorful stickies here at home as well. Lots of different certifications on coaching, on Kanban. And since Christina was name dropping, I have to throw in that I worked with Jeff Patton on learning about user story mapping before he even wrote the book on that topic way back in the day. So that's my claim to fame as well. And as it says there, I've tried the role of Scrum Master / Development Manager / Lead Developer. Definitely not advised to try to do all of those at once. But you know, when you're first learning at that, and the company's really not quite so mature, that's what has to happen sometimes. That's a little bit about me. So let's jump into our first myth. That Kanban is a process improvement tool, not a workflow method. So what is Kanban? Well, strictly speaking, it's a Japanese word that means signboard. And it's really that board that represents your work and the flow of that work through various stages of whatever you need to do to get it done. It's represents also a pull system of work. So we pull things across the board as we have availability, and we determine that availability utilizing our WIP limits, work in progress limits. And so different stages of your workflow, you set different limits on how much of that type of work that you can handle at any given time, depending on the complexity of the team and some other things we'll talk about more later. And then those things flow across the board as you have more availability. So it's really focused on bringing to light those bottlenecks that might exist in your system and maximizing the flow of things to drive things towards getting them done.
Kanban is very similar to Agile and Lean. It's actually a derivative of Lean. So there are principles and there are also values that are held near and dear. And these are the 9 ones that are for Kanban. Similar to Scrum, you're going to have collaboration that's going to be very important. Balance and transparency, making that work visible, and then trying not to take more work in than the system can hold. That goes with flow. Flow is probably the name of the game when it comes to Kanban. It's how fast can we take a ticket, work on it as a group, collaborate, complete it, and get it off of our board. So flow is central. We do focus still on customers, so that's not anything different than anything you're used to. We do have to have an understanding of the system as well as what our customers need from us and what we're going to provide. And then keeping in line with just about every other methodology, leadership and respect are super important when you're talking about Kanban. We need leaders who lead the right way to maximize that flow, but we also need to respect the team and the members that are contributing to our work. And then we all enter in agreements on how we're going to work together, and we make sure that we are keeping in line with our current workflow. Like we want to make sure that our workflow is something that's visible, that we can all work on and collaborate together, and that we are returning value to customers pretty quickly. So very similar to Lean, very similar to Agile, very similar to Scrum, not much different.
The way that we put those things into practice is through that board, we visualize our work. We have those WIP limits in place that help us to manage and maximize our flow, as I've already mentioned, all of them, to understand how we're delivering value, are we delivering value, and reflect on our process to make improvements so that we can improve and evolve our entire Kanban system. So Kanban is a process improvement tool, not a workflow method. Well, sorry, that's busted. Our second one, Kanban is strict and rigid and doesn't allow any breathing room. So let's explore that a little bit. Well, is it strict? It depends on how you structure things. It depends on you and your team. Your board reflects your workflow. So if it's a really complex workflow, then you might have a more complex board. But if it's a more simple process that you have going on, then your Kanban board could be more simplistic. So is it strict? Well, it seems like it's actually kind of flexible. It says make it work for what you need for your team.
And as far as it being rigid, Kanban boards are set up in a way that you can see your flow, and each time a card moves from one status to the next, or from one column to the next, we use these rules called explicit policies, and that's what you're going to use to drive that movement. Those are determined by the team. So as a team, you could make extremely detailed rules, and you can make it very prescriptive, very rigid. But it's not the Kanban board that provides that rigidity. It's the team who is creating these explicit policies. And an important thing to note is not only do you create explicit policies that move it through the flow from beginning to end, but you might have a point in time where you have to move things backwards, where things are no longer priority, they're no longer needed. Maybe you've learned something new, or there's just not enough bandwidth in that WIP to keep it in the column that it's in. So you make policies to move it forward and as well to move it backward. But again, the person creating those is the team. So if you find that you can't fit your rules on a Post-it note, you probably have too many rules for your explicit policies to move these through the flow. And you would create those for each one of your statuses as you move them through. So as far as it being strict, rigid, and not allowing any breathing room, it's busted. You make it that way. Kanban itself is not, and it's not set up to be that way. For our third myth, Kanban is not real agile. The WIP limits remove flexibility and the ability to respond quickly. Well, not really. So WIP limits are actually used to create the space so you can adapt and respond quickly. Most of the time, we're going to start using class of service swim lanes, and this will sound exactly like what you're used to working at with Scrum. So for your Scrum teams, most of us are aware of what an expedited item would be. That would be a hot fix, something that happens, some systems down, something that needs to be delivered ASAP. When those happen, our teams drop everything, everybody swarms that expedited ticket and gets it through the system as quickly as possible. However, Kanban actually has these swim lanes for additional styles that you can use. For example, standard is deliver it when it's available. That's a traditional Kanban thing. As soon as we have got it all the way through the flow, we deploy it to production. Fixed date is when you deliver on a certain date. So that could be very similar to Scrum. Every 2 weeks you're deploying to production. Or my favorite example on a fixed date one is when you're talking about Amazon. Or I'm sorry, not Amazon, Apple. When you're talking about Apple, Apple does now, I think there's semi-annual deployments where they have all these features they bundle and then they present at their conference and they say, hey, look at all the cool new features you're going to get, or the cool new devices, or the cool new hardware shortly. Like, you're not getting them today. They're not just bam, done. It's the next release, or it's the next device that comes out, or they give you a mythical soon deadline, which we're all used to. We work in software. We know sometimes we're not ready when we go to those conferences and present it. So the fixed date gives the ability to bundle those features and deliver them on a certain date. So they're completed, they're in the done column. They just haven't been pushed out into production until that specific date. And the last one's intangibles. This one, we deliver when they're ready to be delivered. And this is usually going to be your tech debt. So anything that you're working on, mitigating risk, tech debt, upgrading a system possibly, maybe looking at the latest and greatest tool and making sure that that's updated. Those you would deliver when it's possible and when it's less intrusive for your customers. So you might be delivering something like if your customers are tax customers and they have a deadline on the 15th, you might strategically say as a group that you'll complete it for delivery on the 18th. So you'll start it maybe the night of the 17th. So we're not starting things too soon. We're starting things when we can deliver them and they're non-intrusive to our customers. But that's how we can use those particular swim lanes and set different delivery dates to keep the team able to adapt and pivot and respond quickly to what our customers need.
Some of the ways that we utilize our swim lanes in conjunction with those WIP limits is that we put in place those limits to make sure that we're not having things get stuck at any particular point in the process. So our WIP limits apply to the workflow going across the columns, but they also apply to the swim lanes. And so as Christina mentioned, you might only let one thing into that expedited swim lane because that's that hot fix. Everybody swarms it. You make sure that you drive that through the flow and get that done as soon as possible. And you can't take on a second one of those at once. And so we're going to say that's our limit for those type. Similarly, you don't want things sitting in validation, waiting. If they've already been built and tested and we just need to validate it, let's swarm on that, get it knocked out and deliver that and recognize that value. So we're putting those WIP limits in place to make sure that things aren't getting stuck, they're not languishing, and that we're getting the maximum flow that we can out of the board.
So I have a couple examples here to kind of show you what happens when you set a work in progress limit too low, too high, or just right, kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? It takes a little bit of time and practice to figure out what the best numbers are for each individual team. But the symptoms when it's too low is that people are idle and it takes a while to get something from beginning to end. So you just have people standing around waiting for work. Whereas the opposite is too high, which is everybody's so busy, nobody can help each other. And the problem with this is we often rely on more than one person to complete our flow. So we need those extra people to have a little bit of space and time and be idle to take on the task when the next status happens. So example might be that if you have somebody who is going to do a code review, you might need to make sure that that person's not also the only person available for coding, because if they're supposed to review their own code, then they're not really doing a code review. So it's very important that we also look to see, what is the flow of the tasks? Is it going slow? So it's going to go really slow when you have a work in progress limit too high. There's just not enough people to work it and to get it completed. So tasks just kind of sit there and they grow stale. When it's just right, though, you get a pretty fast flow, which means as soon as that code is complete, you're handing it off to somebody else who's doing the review, and then they're giving you the changes back. And because you're not picking up another task yet, you've got the time to fix all of those changes, and then you can get it deployed. So you might be idle while you're waiting for that to be completed, but there's a good reason for it. It's because we need you to be ready to go the minute that it's in the next state. So we want to make sure that those people are having some idle time, but they're able to increase and get that fast flow using those work in progress limits. And it's important to understand your current workflow and to know how much time it takes to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, and maybe even look at what an average step time is throughout your entire board. You want to know where those bottlenecks happen. You can't know where the bottlenecks are unless you know about how often something should change the next column. So if you measure those, you'll find where your work in progress limits might be too high or they might be too low.
Yeah, one of the things that's kind of not really explicitly seen here in this short example is that doing column might be 4 or 5 different steps. And so it's kind of masked here. But for instance, if you've got 4 things sitting in that validation step, you might need to have that visibility on that and recognize that there's a bottleneck going on there. And so by breaking down your workflow into those explicit various steps and seeing that visualized on the board, you can quickly see that there's this problem going on in a certain column and use steps to mitigate that. So is it not real agile? Those WIP limits are removing flexibility and the ability to respond quickly. Well, no, we actually have plenty of room for responding quickly. So this one's busted too. So our next one, Kanban can be used only for linear processes or in support teams. So we found a really cool example of Kanban that's used in something completely different. And that's in the Imperial Palace Gardens of Tokyo. Beautiful gardens. You can see all the stats on all the things that it contains. But the way that they're using Kanban is they want to make sure that all of their guests can enjoy the gardens and experience all of the beauty and wonder that are contained therein without being overwhelmed, without being rushed through, without being packed in with tons of other people all at once. So they have a set number of tickets that they have available. And if you go to those gardens and you want to visit, if there are tickets available, they'll usher you in and you can take as long as you want to enjoy the gardens. However, at a certain limit, that WIP limit that they have in place, I don't know what the number is, let's say 500 people total, I don't know. Then they're going to cut things off and they're going to say, you know what, we can't handle more than 500 people at once. It's going to get too crowded. People are going to be unhappy. So if that 501st person comes along, sorry, you have to wait until someone else is done with their experience and they leave and free up those tickets. And so what a brilliant way to implement a Kanban process around something that's totally different from what you might expect.
We have a few other examples for you of Kanban in the wild. So places where you would see Kanban, but maybe not recognize that's what's going on. And we're hoping that maybe you'll start looking for Kanban and the flow as you go through your everyday life like we did. So the first example, I think we all probably can see now, it's Kanban from a traffic signal, right? Like the traffic builds up, you expect it to turn green and open up. So there's no more jams anymore. We get less bottlenecks. So traffic signals, having people who monitor how many, like doing traffic surveys, those type of things, that helps improve our flow. So we can actually get to work back in the days when we all commuted in a little bit quicker by adjusting those lights and the timing. In fact, I forgot to tell Darlene the story earlier, but in my city, they actually time the buses to the lights now. And they're trying to encourage people to take the city buses. And the encouragement is if you take the city bus, then you're guaranteed a quicker commute because they can control the green lights. Now, they did this right before COVID. So it wasn't tried out as much, but now what people found, and you all can probably all guess this, now everybody's trying to swarm and stay around the buses so they get the green lights too. So you do kind of get some backflow on some of this, but it was a great idea in principle, and it does help out keeping our flow and our traffic better monitored. The next one is something I personally do with my kids. I told you that I make them do Kanban. So we have a morning checklist for both my 13-year-old and my 10-year-old. And they go through and they check each thing that they're supposed to do in the morning. And right when we're leaving the door, I can check their check boxes. I can make sure everything's done. I can just point at the list if not everything's completed. I don't have to yell over and over again, hey, did you brush your teeth? Or now there's one I should add on here. Did you put on deodorant? Because they're of that age. But there's lots of things that you can actually take and make these checklists. And then as a parent, you don't have to continuously ask them to do these things over and over again. Probably works with spouses too, and probably works with roommates on things that both of you need to do before you get out in the day. But just a little way to apply it. And then probably the one that's near and dear to my heart, I'm a baker. I bake when I'm stressed. It's my favorite thing to do. But I learned very quickly when I make things that I need to take the extra 5 minutes and go get my ingredients and measure them out. It does help you when you're doing the recipe if you have it already out and already working and already measured out, so you can get through that flow quicker and get something into the oven. With baking, sometimes those chemical reactions are so important to get just right that you can't wait the 5 minutes to go pull the flour out, and then you've got to go and sift it, and then you got to go and figure out is that the right measuring cup, or do you need to dry out the one that's sitting next to the cabinet? So the important thing of this one is to make sure that you go through and you get all of your dry ingredients and your wet ingredients measured out, and then you can whip right through the recipe in order. If you ever want to see this not work, There's two great shows. So if you watch Chopped, watch the first episode or the beginning of the episode where they start measuring stuff, and that's going to be the last time you see them measuring. From that point forward, they're using their hands, they're using everything else because time is of the essence. But then look at how much they miss or they forget to do or they drop, or how many times the judges say not enough salt or too much salt. Maybe it's because they didn't pre-measure. So when push comes to shove, we have a lot of problems. I also recommend on this one Hell's Kitchen. There is, if you watch the beginning of the season, same thing. You'll see everybody, measuring out carefully Gordon Ramsay's recipes. And by about the middle of the show, they'll have ditched all of their measuring. And that's when you start seeing Gordon spit out the food that they bring him because they didn't measure or they didn't plan ahead. So maybe something had completely baked and then they remembered that the seasonings weren't on it. So then they try to, fake it and add it back on and it tastes horrible. So very important when you're doing menu preparation or doing any type of cooking that you plan ahead and that you make sure that you have all of those supplies ready to go so you can just go from your flow beginning to end. And then the last one, how many of us use an app to get us through traffic or to get us from point A to point B? I mean, I'm really guilty. I use Waze just to go to the grocery store on the corner. I just want to know the quickest way out of my neighborhood. But how many times does it pop up and say, hey, we found a faster way for you to get this. We can change your route, minimal change, and then we can turn around and we can actually get back on the road, or we can get you to your destination even quicker if you take this change. That's because that system is looking for the fastest flow to get you there. And sometimes we have traffic thanks to those lights. The original way through wouldn't have worked. So we do have to make our changes. And I see a lot of chats coming in about that one. So as far as Kanban being used only for linear processes or to support teams, I think we can clearly show that that one's busted. There's lots of applications in real life today, and there's lots of ways that we can use it that aren't just straight linear processes. This one is probably my most favorite. But Darlene, do you want to handle this one?
Sure, yeah. So is it easier? Does it have no meetings or ceremonies? Well, if you ask somebody who's out in the wild doing it, I'm sure that's what you're going to hear. So let's explore this myth a little bit. Because does it have ceremonies? Well, yes, it does. It has 7 ceremonies, all with their own cadence and all with their own expectations of how information is flowing, where changes occur, how much those impact each other. And it's actually a really complicated system if you put it into place as it's originally designed. The problem is most people aren't aware of all this stuff because they don't study about what Kanban actually does. And they think that they can just say, oh, it has no ceremonies at all. It's just about this board and we have our flow. So is it easier? Well, I don't know. Does it have no meetings or ceremonies? Well, yes, it does, if you're doing it correctly. If you're doing some strange Frankenstein version of Kanban, then maybe not. Our next one, no one estimates in Kanban. Estimates are useless. Christina?
Yeah, so I love this one. I am a big follower of #NoEstimates. I will work with you to make things smaller and similar sized more than I will let you estimate. But we do gather estimates in Kanban. In fact, I like the way we do them in Kanban. Basically, what you're going to do is when you set up your cards, you will have a spot for each one of your statuses. So each one of your columns that were in your Kanban board. And you will estimate how long it will take you to get through that particular status. So maybe for design by the team, it takes us 1 day. Maybe for development, it takes us 2 full days. And maybe for testing, we agree it's going to take us 1 day. Now, working as a team, we don't know who that's going to be. We just know that it's going to take us about this long based on past tickets, and that's how much time we've got. We're marking off the days as we go through our flow, and we can kind of see with these little, this is like a paper card. You would have like little boxes that you could check off, or in Darlene, what she used to do is they would stamp up the date on the particular task, so you'd know what date and how long it was spending in each one of those statuses. Then at the bottom, you would put like the day that you deployed, the day that it was ready, and then you would calculate your cycle time.
But what if our tool is electronic? How are we going to capture all that information? Well, there should be a field for it. You can see that you can show your effort in the story point field. You can capture which state it's in. You can capture who it's assigned to, all the tags that are associated with it. And if there aren't something, if there isn't a field that's built into your system that makes sense for you, you can always create custom fields to capture whatever you need. So shouldn't be a problem to make all of that information visible, even if you're using an electronic tool. So no one's estimating a Kanban. Estimates are useless. Sorry, they're doing all that. They're busted. So is there no capacity or velocity in Kanban? So we have no forecasting? Well, actually, there are those WIP limits, and those are showcasing what our team's capacity is. We're utilizing that exact bit of information to show how things are flowing across that board and where we have capacity to take on more work of that particular type, or if we're maxed out. So that's exactly what that captures for us. And our velocity is simply that those cards that are moving through the board, and you can measure how many cards you got done in a certain time period. Maybe you use 2 weeks, maybe you use some other measurement, but in a certain time frame, you can capture how many cards are finishing and begin to utilize an average number of cards that are getting done. And that's exactly what velocity captures for us. So it's exactly the same as what you're used to from a Scrum type of approach. You're tracking your capacity and velocity and making those visible to utilize for informing what you can get done or where you have capacity available.
And we use a couple graphs. I think the cumulative flow is less used in Scrum, but it should be used in both. And what you can do is you get really good at reading these when you spend a lot of time with them. But each band's width tells a lot of details about what the team is doing right now. So our example has 3 bands. So we have 3 states. Green is usually closed, and then you have red and blue. So these show that we're spending equal time in both of those particular statuses. Now, every time they pinch and every time that they grow away from each other, it tells us more about our teams. It might tell us that we've got a bottleneck. It might tell us that more items entered the flow at that point in time. It might tell us that we've got, our work in progress limit needs to be readjusted because we've got too much in one status and not enough in another. So looking at your cumulative flow will help you and your teams understand what they could do and adjust on their board. The other one that we really like is the lead time distribution. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to calculate your lead time, and you're going to calculate how many days and how many cards have that lead time. And you look at them over time. So in this example, you can see where the team's mode would be. So how often are we having that particular size of story or that many days? So this one is 6. This one, you can also look at the median, like half the user stories take less time than 9 days to complete. The other half is taking more than 9 times, actually almost up to 45 days. And then as a team, we can kind of retrospect on those outliers that are taking longer to get done to find out, do we need to start making our stories smaller? Are those correct? Maybe we started calculating and we ended up with a bunch of stories that we put back in the process because they weren't as priorities. So the time never stops. So therefore we would have a longer one. But it gives us the ability to make those changes to our flow and look at how we're prioritizing, how we're creating those cards, and what it needs to get done.
So it's 6 days, not 6 stories?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I knew I was going to say that one backward. I always do.
It's what, about 29 stories had 6 days that they got done.
The purple line.
There's a
Yeah.
question in the chat. Where do you see 6 days or?
Yeah, that's the one that Darlene was just saying. It's the purple line. I said it wrong. It should be the purple line is 6 days, and there are about 29 stories right now that are done within the 6-day time frame. So it's the most often done.
So it's worth capturing that that information in your cards and using your tools to create these kind of graphs and being able to draw. There's a lot of information that you can glean from tracking your lead time and charting it out like this. And it can help to, again, expose where some additional bottlenecks are happening. Why is it taking the more than 9 days for so many of our stories? Half of the stories are taking more than 9 days. So let's explore that and see what's happening. Sorry, was there another question? I thought I heard someone else start to ask something a moment ago. Oh, the red, blue, and green, that's on our cumulative flow. So the green is closed, the blue is in progress, and the red is our backlog of new stories.
Yep. And if you go into Azure DevOps or you go into Jira, you can actually pull that one up pretty quick. It's got it for almost every Scrum team. And you can actually see for your current teams what these are. It takes a while to get used to seeing all of the pinches and all of the expansions, but once you do, you start seeing patterns with your teams. For my teams in particular, we noticed really quick that they were waiting until day 9 and 10 to close stories. So we ended up with all this work in progress, and then all of a sudden it was all shut. And then all this work in progress, no shut. So, pinch is when the when your this one is a little bit different because red and blue are pretty similar. Probably need to swap this out for one where they're a little bit different. But you see how your red and your blue are going along like this, and then they go up and then they start to come down. That's the pinch that we're kind of looking for, is when one status is bigger and the other status is smaller.
Right. So if you added a whole bunch of new stories to your backlog, but they weren't in progress yet, you'd see the red grow wider. And if that example that Christina gave a moment ago for the team that closed out a whole bunch of testing stories all on the last day of the sprint, well, then the blue would close down and pinch to almost nothing because all those got closed and there wasn't anything else in progress until the next sprint began again, and then that blue would grow.
And you can use this, like I said, with your Scrum teams too. I find it very eye-opening to notice how we're doing from status to status. You can also tell really quickly if the teams have in the blue when they're in progress, if at the beginning of the sprint, all of them go blue, that means we're working on too much stuff at the very beginning. We need to get better at pacing ourselves. So I highly recommend doing some research on those and learning how to read them.
All right, so is there no capacity or velocity in Kanban and no forecasting? Well, hopefully we understand now that we have exactly those things, so there can be forecasting about what's possible. So we've busted that one as well. And our last one, and the most pervasive of all the myths, is that Kanban is easy to master and to implement. Let's explore that one. So is it easy? Well, actually, hopefully by what we saw about the ceremonies a little bit ago, it requires a lot of discipline to set up those ceremonies, to create the right board, to be able to showcase all of the steps of our workflow, to figure out how to break down our work items so that they're flowing correctly, to put them into the right swim lanes, and then to capture all of the different things that are happening. There's a lot of complexity. We're showcasing dependencies, breaking those out if needed. And so there's a lot to it, actually.
And one big aspect of Kanban that we kind of gloss over, but I think is really important to note, is that product owners are always refining in Kanban. The team is set to pick the next most priority item and bring into the workflow. And those might be, like in this example, they're color coded by type. So based on what column, that's the item that's going into that, based on what swim lane, that's what it's going into. So the team here, if they're picking up feature A5 and they've just gotten that urgent business need, then chances are that's no longer going to be priority. That red is going to get bumped down and that urgent business need is going to get brought up, and that's going to be what the team goes and works on. But the product owner has to always be refining and changing those priorities so the team pulls the next most priority piece of work. Otherwise, the danger is the team would work on something that's less of a priority. So whereas in Scrum, we might get together and have planning and have refinement, and then it's kind of locked over the next 2 weeks. You don't have that in Kanban. It could change every day, which goes back to those ceremonies. That's why you have a daily walk of the board. That's why there's those daily meetings. That's why there's refinement happening every single day, and that teams don't start out working on something thinking they're going to complete it possibly on the board first, because they might have something with a higher priority that comes in and bumps it out. So because we've got the eye on the whip and we're clearing the blocks and we're shifting those priorities, it takes a lot of work to maintain a Kanban board, and a lot of experience in maintaining them from a product owner point of view.
So I see the question that just popped up a moment ago that says, what if you don't have a PO? With Kanban, Scrum roles are not required, right? You want to take that one?
So we learned a lot about roles when we were in class, and there's still a product owner. There's still usually an agile coach that's takes the place of a Scrum Master that's walking the board. There's still a product person. Now, there was people who mentioned they have DevOps teams that do this. For DevOps, you might have a manager who acts as the product owner, but it's the person who is making sure that those tickets are constantly reshuffled that we're talking about being the product owner here. They're what's the most valuable to the business in that case, instead of what's most valuable to the customer, but they're the one who is acting as the product owner for the board. And I see that a lot with my DevOps teams. But while they may not have the name and sit in product, they definitely run that role while they're doing Kanban.
Yeah, that happens often with teams that it may not be your explicit job title, but you're filling the role of the product owner within the team. So our next question I see is that, are the POs prioritizing the swim lanes? For example, because the swim lane is associated with the sticky, because the swim lane is associated with the feature. Well, the swim lane is how you get the flow going across your board. So it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the particular feature or that particular sticky. It's how you it's when you need to deliver that item. So if it's that expedited, you're going to put that at the top, and if you have the capacity, you're going to drive that one across the board. If it's their standard, then you're going to drop that in and deliver that as you have that availability. You could have some things that are grouped together on those fixed date items. And then our fourth swim lane was for those intangibles. So you deliver those as you can, and as you have the capacity to take on items for that. If there's something where maybe it's a security patch for a library that your code is based on, and that you have until 3 months out that before that library is going to have this issue. So you might put that in the intangible at first. If you have the ability to deliver it sooner, great. Eventually, though, you might have to actually shift that thing in. Have to get this thing done by such and such a date, or we're going to be exposed to this security hole. So that's some different ways that you can utilize those swim lanes. So that's really what that is all about.
And we did have another question come in.
Okay.
Where would you show the dependencies or the things waiting on dependencies?
So the whole name of the game with Kanban is maximizing flow. So if there's something that has a dependency, then it shouldn't be anywhere on your board. That other dependency is the thing that should be pushed across your board. If something's on your board and it's got a dependency, then it's going to be stuck and taking up one of your pieces of your WIP limit or wherever it's stuck at. So absolutely, we want to find ways to keep those in the backlog and drive those other things to the top of that priority list to get those dependencies resolved first before we prioritize the work that is dependent on that priority or on that dependency.
And a good example I can think of is my DevOps teams often say, Christina, I did it and I deployed it for the team, but the team's on Scrum, so they're not going to be able to look at it for 2 whole weeks. So it needs to stay on our board for 2 weeks. I'm like, no, it doesn't. We did it. We completed it. We gave it to the team. Tell the team at the end of their 2 weeks, if they have another problem with it, they need to get back with our team. And then we can create a ticket based on what the change is, because we've delivered exactly what was given to us to deliver. There's no reason for us to hold on to it until we hear something back from that team. When we hear something back, we're going to create a new ticket anyway. We're not going to take the ticket all the way back across the system and then start it with those changes. So it makes no sense to go ahead and keep that on there. So some teams might opt to split their stories around those dependencies if they're related to another team. So maybe it's task A gets completed and given to that team, so that goes to done. When that team's done and they come back and tell us the next thing, then it gets put in as a card by itself. It gets prioritized with the rest of the backlog and then starts working again with that team when they have the availability for it. This one's always the fun one because we get lots of questions.
Yep. All right. So.
And then I didn't want to ignore Taz's comment. It is very true. Kanban tells you to meet your teams where they're at with roles. They don't prescribe specific roles really, but they do talk about the ownership of the board. And when you're talking about the board, there's always going to be somebody who is prioritizing that queue. Product owner is used most likely in most companies, whereas the person who is walking the board and helping the team is usually an agile coach instead of a scrum master.
Great, thanks. I missed that one when it scrolled past it before I saw it.
Yep, and then we'll wrap this up and then we can go back to the next question, which was about the ceremonies, because I love talking about those.
Yeah. All right, so some of you may see that I clicked ahead already, that hopefully we've caught on already that all of these are busted. But this one is the most pervasive, as I said, the most fundamental thing. It's easy only if we're doing it the wrong way. And there's a lot of teams out there that are doing Kanban the wrong way. It takes a lot of effort to master it and to implement it as it's designed. And that complexity is there to help you. So it's important to learn about Kanban and to understand these ceremonies. And we'll take a look at them more here in a moment, so that you can utilize what's built into this system to help you to derive more flow and to ensure that the right levels of communication are happening.
Yeah, I would say the number one thing I hear from teams when they tell me that they want to try Kanban is that they want to get rid of deadlines and they need more time to complete items. And they just feel if they had Kanban, they would be able to take 3 weeks, 4 weeks to complete an item instead of Scrum, which is making it smaller. So instead, what I challenge them to is 1 week increments, because really in Kanban, the name of the game is to get cards completed and out the door. Most teams want to keep that done within a week, because seeing stuff sit there over the weekend becomes a problem, especially when it comes to prioritization. You don't want things sitting there 3 weeks on your board. They take away so much time and attention from other things you could be doing. So instead, we would ask those teams to start looking at cutting those stories down, go to a smaller scope, go to something that you can complete in 1 to 2 weeks, because that's what you're going to be asked to be doing in Kanban. You're not going to be gifted magically 3 weeks because now there's an open-ended deadline.
All right, so we find my way back to our diagrams on the ceremonies real quick. Here we go.
Starting at the top.
Yeah, I was trying to see what the specific question was, but it's just more on the ceremonies. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So there's a strategy review that's done quarterly. And in theory, so should your Scrum team leadership groups be doing as well, right? They should know on a quarterly basis and be reporting on a quarterly basis at the strategy level. What are the strategic goals that we want to do as a company? And that's what would happen in that particular meeting. And by having that strategy review meeting, you would inform the operations review. In the operations review, people might make changes to your strategy based on resource allocation, based on funding, based on anything that's operational for the company at the time. I think it's very important to notice that all of these flow in and out of each other. So some of them inform, some of them will actually change what's learned in that particular meeting. So that's why we talk about how many there are. So monthly, there's an operations review that goes through and kind of looks at, can we get the completed strategy done? Do we have the right people? Do we have the right timing? Are customers at a spot where we can even interrupt them? Darlene and I worked for a tax company, and if we had ever said, let's make a strategic change to a 1040 form in December 31st, we would have probably been laughed out the building. There's no way they're letting us do that because it's too much for our customers. So we might decide on that operations review that it's a bad time to be doing a big change. So maybe we change the priority of what order we go in.
And even if that kind of thing was pushed ahead, it would be looked at in the risk review. And the risk review would definitely say, absolutely not. We're not taking that on. It's too risky. But other decisions that are made in the risk review, as you can see, could inform our service delivery review as well as our delivery planning meetings. And so it gets really complicated as you're tracing through this different flow. So it's definitely worth doing some research to understand what's being accomplished in each one of these. In that service delivery review, we're taking a look at what are those services that our teams are making changes to or able to deliver, and those are being informed by different things, different pieces. You can see that it's being informed by things that are being delivered daily in our stand-ups, as well as those risks. It's sending information back to our operations review, it's sending information to our strategy reviews so that those can incorporate that feedback loop and bring that information back from what the teams are doing on the day-to-day basis and make changes to potentially our entire strategy, as well as when we think we're going to deliver something, why are we delivering it in the first place? All those things are all interconnected anyways. This is just putting a little bit more structure around it.
Yeah, and similar to Scrum, they have replenishment meetings, stand-up meetings, replenishments weekly for the most part. It might be daily if you have one of those hot fixes come in that you need to change. Daily, you're having those stand-up meetings and walking the boards. And then there's a delivery planning meeting that's per delivery cadence. These three, I think, fit basically what we do, most teams in Scrum. They have a refinement, which is basically a replenishment, just not as often. They have a stand-up daily, which is the same. We just walk the board from the left to the right. We walk through completed back to what we've got coming into the process. Whereas in Scrum, we usually talk about what status we've got for the work that's not completed. And then the delivery planning meeting is similar to our review, where you're talking about what stuff is ready to be delivered and go out in the real world. And everybody's kind of making sure they've got that delivery cadence expectation done.
And you can see that it's also subdivided into the three groupings that we have around some of these. So our strategy review and what goes into those replenishment meetings are focused on building the right thing. We've got the box around those things in the upper right for building the thing the right way. And then we've got the team that's trying to focus on generating good flow and building those things fast and delivering those things. I see a ton of messages popping up in the chat. So let's see.
And Sherry has her hand up. Sherry, do you want to unmute? Do you have a question?
What does replenishment mean? So replenish, that's the first question I see. Replenishment is really focused on, it's sort of where you do the refinement. You're replenishing that backlog that we referred to for what the team's going to work on next. You could be making adjustments to priority as well. So that's what really is happening at that replenishment meeting. When it happens, beginning of the week, end of the week, doesn't really matter. It's whatever makes sense for that particular team, as long as it's happening on a regular cadence. That's the important part.
I have a lot of teams that I work with that are distributed globally, and they do replenishment changes during the middle of the week rather than a Monday or a Friday, because those tend to be the most holidays and they tend to be when people take off the most. So Mondays and Fridays are the worst days to interrupt their flow. So they choose Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday based on their time zones to make those revisions.
All right. I don't see any other questions popping up there. If I jump back ahead, that does get us through to the end of our slides. We've had lots of good questions already. We'll be happy to field some more.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're safe like, so think on multi-sprint planning, right? And some teams are Scrum teams and some teams are Kanban teams. And so what we say a lot is that the Kanban teams at least have to plan their dependencies, because if a Scrum team is dependent on you, they need to know. So we have the Kanban teams do 2-week time boxes so that they do their reviews and every 2 weeks. And we say that if you're going to play, we're going to plan the next 12 weeks, and we do need the Kanban teams to make those things fixed dates, those dependencies fixed dates, so that the Scrum teams can understand when you'll deliver the work. Is that something pretty common, or is there a different way to do that?
I think that makes sense. Generally speaking, I've seen plenty of teams work that way in the past, I should say, that for those things that are dependencies that the other team needs, it's perfectly acceptable to say, we need it by a certain date, and to expect that to match up with a fixed date type of swim lane approach. There may be some challenges there depending on what else that team that's on the receiving end of that request, what else they have on their plate, what else they have on their board. So if they're getting a lot of requests like that from multiple sources, they might have to reallocate their WIP limit and put more capacity into fixed date deliveries. They're not overburdened. That's one of the challenges that could happen. If it's requests just coming from one team, then it's probably manageable. But if they're getting it from multiple sources or multiple fixed date things, they might have to set up separate swim lanes for each delivery date, so that they make sure that those things are being pushed through on the right cadence and not getting stuck or getting overburdened by one and missing out on the delivery for another. So there's a lot of different ways that you can subdivide the work and utilize the information that your board gives you to be more transparent about where your capacity is or isn't, more importantly, to make sure that folks understand when something's getting stuck or if the team is overburdened.
Thank
I
you.
would also caution about asking that team for that work before that fixed date, because a lot of times what these teams are doing is they're balancing that fixed date with stuff that doesn't have a fixed date. And it may be that if you ask for it 2 weeks from now, they know it's going to take them about a day and a half, maybe 2 days to get the work completed as a team, and they're just going to rally it. So they're not going to start working on it for 8 days. So if I, as a Scrum Master on one team, start bugging them and say, is it done? Is it done? Is it done? And they know it's not due for 2 weeks, I might really irritate that group. But if it's about day 8 of my sprint, I should probably be asking them if we're going to be good to go for them deploying to us on the day 10, so we can pick it up and start working on it next.
Thank you.
I also saw one in here. Estimating points versus time. This is probably one of my favorite little questions I get a lot as a coach and as a scrum master is people ask me, since I'm big into hashtag no estimates, I like breaking things into similar size and trying to complete tasks within a week at the very longest. As you can tell, I've got, I use that 1 week. I think people can estimate what they're doing this week a heck of a lot better than they can estimate what they're going to do next week. So I work with teams on that. And the reason I like the Kanban boards way of estimating, which is more on time and not points, is because we're looking at, as a team, how fast can we get through the design phase? And we're all on board to get it through the design phase. So if you've got a team that's taking spikes and they're dragging spikes out to all eternity, they can't do that when they're on the Kanban board and they have a 1 day for that design. That means the person who's in charge of design and picked up that task and has got that whip for the day knows they drop it and they design it that day. Like, that's what we've got. If you need more than 1 day, then you have to talk about it with your team and have a good reason. But I think it becomes easier on the Kanban board, and you're estimating how long it takes you to get through your flow. You're not estimating how many hours worth of work you're doing. You could probably add it up at the end and see how accurate it is, but that cycle time is what you're going for. Like, how often are we delivering something within our 5-day threshold that we're trying to push?
But at some level, you're literally estimating like that ticket of work. And so unless your work is really pretty consistent, you're not allowing for, variability and complexity. I don't know. It's just different way of
Yeah.
looking at
So that's one of the things that we really try to push towards is that you break it down into small enough chunks that complexity kind of gets blurred out. If everything is, maybe a 2-day story, then the level of complexity that you can have baked into something that's that small might make it a 1, it might make it a 3, but for the most part, they're going to average out to be about 2. And then at that point, the difference in size becomes negligible. It just kind of averages out. And so that's one of the kind of key components of that no estimates movement that we love to push folks towards using.
Yeah, so in those kind of complex ones, sometimes what Darlene and I will also recommend is they break out the research from the proof of concept they're going to do and any design and development work from that original ticket. So the original ticket's completing the work, but they're getting that complexity through other stories and other tasks mitigated as a team. And it helps, so then you have more eyeballs and more brains working on the problem rather than having just one person go off in a silo and work on it and then be responsible for also the complex story later. So it gets you that knowledge sharing right up front.
Yeah, I just have to say, the no estimates thing is kind of a myth in its own. It's like saying we're never have to spend any time thinking about this. But it's sure you're not picking a story point number, but you're still spending the time to break it down and are in effect estimating the size of it to be small chunks.
Exactly. I say that what you do is you basically cut off the end of the rope where we're arguing whether it's a 3, 5, or 8, and we're putting it up front with the description of what work it would take to make it a 3, a 5, or an 8. So
Right.
It's really taking you the same amount of time. It's just not having the argument over a specific number and getting all of those questions answered out front to figure out how are we going to split it? Because ultimately, what are you going to do? You're going to split it. So why not just start up that at the beginning and not worry about whether it's you're using Fibonacci or somebody wants to add a 0.5 in and it blows up your tool, or all those fun things that happen when you put a number in there.
And what it also does is it helps you to better refine those stories up front. You're talking it through and helping everyone to understand better what it's trying to achieve and how it's going to deliver value. And so, yes, you're still investing time in the process. But as Christina said, you're not wasting it arguing over the numbers. You're doing something valuable with that effort to talk about what this thing is and how it can be organized and what it's going to do and putting a lot of thought around it in that way instead.
So they say the most important part of story pointing is a conversation around what this story really is. So you're saying have that conversation is still needed, but you just don't point it at the end.
Right. Or you agree, like, we're always we can only do a 3 within a week. We know we can only do a 3. So if this isn't a 3 right off the bat and one of us puts our hand up and says it feels larger than a week's worth of work, then we just go ahead and don't even worry about it. We just go ahead and start splitting it right then. How can we split this to make it fit? What can we learn about it that would make it go faster for us as a team? Darlene and I, when we both joined our team together, we brought our estimation practices to the group, and I'll tell my numbers first and then Darlene can tell hers, because any coach can tell you that their teams estimate a number in a day. Like, it's hard to get teams to not think about it in hours anyway. But like, my team was, 1 is like, I can get it done today. A 3 is I can get it done in about half a week. A 5 is I can get it done by the end of the week. And an 8 is it takes the whole iteration long. That's what my teams came up with. So we had it pretty set and we knew what things were. And if we had more than 1 8, we immediately started dividing things. But Darlene, tell them your team's numbers if you remember them.
I think they had a 13 as the full iteration, and then the 8 was a week, and the 5 was like 3 to 4 days, and the 3 was 2 to 3 days, and so yeah, it was definitely a different kind of scale. But so yeah, there's a lot of different variants, and so it's all how it works out with your team. But one of the things that I have challenged teams to do in the past, Christina mentioned how we've both done things with dojos before. One of the things I always love to do with a team that has gone through a dojo experience with me is to tell them, during this engagement, you're only getting 2 days for an iteration. And so whatever it takes to break those stories down into 2 days to understand, build, develop, test, and consider that thing absolutely completely done, that's what you're going to do for the length of this dojo. And of course, teams balk at that, and people are like, what are you doing to us? This is really hard. But for the most part, by the end of a few weeks of doing that kind of a process, they're like, oh my God, we love it. Let's keep doing this forever, because they see how easy it is to deliver value once you get used to trying to do that. It's hard at first, absolutely, I understand that, but it forces that flow, and it forces you to get those things into those minute little chunks that still deliver value. And so it's a really interesting experiment to do with your team. And I definitely would recommend trying it out.
Yeah, and the cool thing about doing 2-day iterations, which we love, is that the teams also get feedback every 2 days on what they developed. So if you've got somebody who's working on a service, they're talking to the teams, walking them through their service. If they happen to name the database fields differently, they can nip it in the bud right there and get it fixed live during that demo. Product owners are seeing things, but people are seeing progress every 2 days instead of wondering, where are we at on this? And you can also find if somebody's stuck. And I had one gentleman who was completely stuck. He didn't know where to go. And after the second research 4 days, the team caught on, and the team's like, how can we help? So then they were able to storm together and find out what it was. And it ended up being some service that was blocked that he just needed access to. But it gets the teams to ask questions to each other sooner. So I always challenge mine, let's see what we can accomplish in less time. Whereas they always want to see how much more time would I give them to complete something. I'm like, I could give you infinity, but that doesn't help our customers. We need to figure out, what do we not know that we need to know to move forward faster.
Thanks, Doug, for putting our LinkedIn into the chat. Appreciate that.
Yeah, just use it.
Can follow up on that. Other questions for us on anything that we've talked about here today?
I think there were some questions in the chat about product owners, service manager, service lead, all those kinds of titles. What's your experience on this?
I see people in Kanban more likely to have the agile coach title and then to have some sort of non framework title that has the role of a PO. So I think there's a difference between a title and a role. So you might have your operational title that you operate with at the company, and the company might call you a service manager, but you might have the actual role as well on that team as product owner. I've seen a lot of delivery managers that have the role of product owner in my DevOps teams. So I think we have to remember that you might have both. Like you might have a weird title. I had a weird title, like I have a weird title right now. Mine's Enterprise Product Development Coach. Basically, it means I help people at the C-suite build products. That's basically what it means. But that means at times I'm acting as an agile coach. At times I'm acting as a scrum master. At times I am working as their product owner with them to help refine stuff, or maybe I'm even a product manager. So it just depends on, I think you're going to have people who it might be hard to define who has the role of product owner right now. But I think it's a great idea for the team to know who has the role of product owner, even if that's not their title. Darlene, have you seen some crazy ones?
Oh, sure, certainly. There's definitely been lots of different ways that titles get blended together with roles or not. My company recently decided that we don't have product owners anymore. Everybody's a product manager. And so that required a lot of reworking of how I've been teaching things for years, to blend those two roles together and help everybody understand, if originally they had been one or the other, how they needed to take on additional responsibilities and do both. That's one, certainly an interesting way that things play out as well.
Yeah,
and
and
I
I've
just
also
realized
seen
that I was just going to add that I realized that you mentioned your own title, and I didn't happen to mention that before, that mine is Agile Transformation Lead at my company. And so helping the entire company understand what Agile stuff is, and coaching at sort of the enterprise level, and advising product division leads on how to structure their teams and how to set things up.
And I would also say that we've noticed a trend where people have dual roles. So they go to sleep maybe a delivery lead, or not even a delivery lead, a dev lead, and they wake up in the morning and now they're scrum master for the team, ding, with no training. So that
Hopefully you
dual
remember that.
rolling. Yeah,
Hopefully you remember that from my intro slide.
yeah.
Do not try to blend roles. These are important things. And there's a reason that they were carved out as important roles in Scrum or Kanban. And the more that you blend those roles together, or expect someone to fulfill more than one, the more problematic it's going to be, especially if you're trying to do those things across multiple teams then as well. You're just setting folks up for a lot of issues, a lot of problems, and for things to fall through the cracks and get missed. And ultimately, that's exactly what we don't want to have happening. We want to bring things to light and have folks focused on how to deliver good flow and value for our customers. And if they're overburdened, then they can't do that. And think back to our agile principle of sustainable levels of work for folks to do.
And adding to that, when Darlene and I find people that are like that, when we can help them with WIP and showing capacity, but we can also show what managers could be getting from that team if they didn't dual role. And that usually is probably the most help, is showing them that by having somebody, they tell you that they're 50% on one team, 50% on the other. It's not really true. They're only 30% on both, because they lose 40% for context switching. So we can show them that they can gain even more WIP on the board if that person was full-time dedicated to that team. But sometimes you have to have those numbers to kind of walk them back through all of that.
Nice. I love that you worked in our favorite slide that we present ever, which is on that myth of our being able to multitask. Doesn't have it's not a Kanban myth. It's just a general myth that folks can multitask, and how much you lose to those context switches when you do that sort of stuff.
I had a team at one point, they were very good at, you know, how many teams you're on and what percentage. And this poor person had, was on 5 teams and allocated 175% of the time.
Brilliant.
Yes.
But probably only paid for 85% of that work. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's usually when sustainable pace makes people migrate to a new company, and we don't blame them. Like, nobody wants to
No.
work that much, and nobody wants to have to attend 5 scrums and 5 daily stand-ups. And I mean, that takes all their time. If they have 5 teams, like Darlene and I have been scrum master for 3 teams before at a time, and the 3 teams pretty much is a full-time job for a scrum master and then some. Like, I can't imagine being a developer and needing some brain space outside of meetings to actually get work completed. That's not going to happen. And it's a waste of resources, really. People think that they're, you know, getting all of these projects touched, but really what they're doing is they're saying that no project's important and no project needs to be prioritized and completed. Just little
Yeah.
bits and pieces of them do.
You're just adding in additional bottlenecks by allocating somebody like that.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That's why we love sitting at the levels we're at right now, because we can influence some of those changes a little bit better than when we're just sitting on the teams individually. Now we know how to talk to management and C-suite and get them to understand how they can better choose how they staff those projects or products to make sure that they have the right resources and they have the right level of WIP going through, maximizing that flow.
Well, any more questions? So thank you very much, Darlene and Christina. This was a great presentation.
Thank you all for having
Thank
us.
you.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really cool to be here with y'all.
Yeah, lots of great questions.
So our presentation next month is not up on the meetup yet, but it's going to be on November 15th. So we'll go back to our Tuesday nights, and it's going to be Amit Dewan is going to present on the Agile buzz and the cost we pay. Are we advancing ourselves at the cost of basics? Are we forgetting the why Agile at the cost of frameworks? Let's find out from industry experiences and from one another. You know, we've all been in that situation where, you know, we're scaling, we're doing Agile, but we're really not doing it. We're really not doing the basics. That is our presentation, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.